Welcome to World History. Today we're going to look at what the world in the Americas looked like after the Spanish conquest and briefly study the Spanish colonial system. So, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain how the Spanish Empire was organized and analyze how various groups would feel about various Spanish policies. You also need to look at the effect of having this massive colonial empire on Spain itself and how this would lead other European countries to look at trying to copy what Spain is doing and potentially create their own overseas empires. So let's get into this really, really depressing story. The Spanish Empire was originally designed to be very decentralized because honestly, Isabella and Ferdinand didn't really expect Columbus to find anything. And so originally, whoever discovered and captured these new territories would get full control or get to be the viceroy or the little king over all these territories and would get the vast majority or would get a small portion of any fortune that was captured from these areas. The problem is, once they discovered exactly how much land was being captured, the king and queen realized that basically allowing whoever captured this land to control it meant that they were going to lose out on a significant amount of this wealth. And so they went back on this policy and instead divided up their empire into these 4 different viceroyalties, or very sort of large mini kingdoms. Each of these kingdoms had a viceroy, and in general, Spain didn't really care, at least in the early years, what happened in these areas, as long as a fifth of the treasure would get shipped back to Spain. This was known as the Royal Fifth. And it would finance massive amounts of cultural and economic growth within Spain itself. The main way that Spaniards controlled the territory they had captured is through a system called encomienda. Encomiendas are basically large sort of estates/plantations with the idea that a Spaniard would be given control over this large estate that we see here. And in exchange, they would also get control of all the Native Americans on the estate. Theoretically, they would convert the Native Americans to Christianity, and then in exchange, the Native Americans would work for them for a period of time. In reality, unfortunately, it became more or less a system of slavery, with the Native Americans forced to work increasingly long hours in terrible conditions, and the Spaniards not doing much as far as the protecting/converting Native Americans. The end result is that the population of Native Americans absolutely crashed, and the Spaniards had to go further and further to try to find/capture Native Americans to work on their plantations. Eventually, the Native American population of the Caribbean crashed to almost nothing, and the Spaniards would start importing African slaves in order to replace the dead Native Americans. We're going to talk much more about the terrible institution of slavery next time, but for now, just understand that it happened partially because of the absolute devastation that the encomienda system inflicted on the Native Americans. One of the Spaniards who argued against this terrible treatment of the Native Americans was Bartolomé de las Casas. He's known as the defender of the Indians because he tried to argue that the Indians are people and we shouldn't be killing them/working them to death. He was so successful at trying to argue his case, and we'll look at some of his work in class because it's very important, that he ended up getting the king to pass what are called the new laws, whose goal was to protect Native Americans. The problem, unfortunately, is that the Spanish were really dependent on Native Americans for labor, and so these new laws were not followed. And eventually, Native Americans were replaced with African slaves who were treated equally as poorly. So Bartolomé de las Casas tried to get the Spanish to treat their workers better, and in general, he failed. Over time, the Spanish developed a system to sort of control and create a hierarchy of races in the New World. This was known as the Casta System. On the top of this caste, this racial caste system, were Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain, and we're going to talk about this more in class. But if you need to oversimplify this system, the whiter you are, the closer to the top you are, And the less white you are, the closer to the bottom of the system that you are. And so you've got the two predominantly white groups on top, and then less white mixed race groups in the middle, and then Native Americans and enslaved people on the bottom. There was some ability to move up and down in this caste system, and we'll talk more about this in class. But in general, it's a racist caste system designed to promote keeping white people on top at the expense of everybody else. So obviously, white people were much more in favor of this system, and non-white people didn't super appreciate being thrown into lower castes based on their birth. The effect of all of this in Spain was it led to the Spanish Golden Age. Massive amounts of silver and cash crops like sugar and some gold were found in the New World and were brought back to Spain. There was some fighting between the Spanish and the Portuguese over territory in the New World, but they came up with a compromise in that the Pope drew a line down the center of the world and divided it up between the Spanish and the Portuguese. This is known as the Treaty of Tordesillas. And here is your line of demarcation. The result of this is the Portuguese, in the early years, controlled most of Africa and a little bit of Brazil here. And the Spanish are going to control most of what is today Latin America. And so we see this language divide even today, where most of Central and South America speak Spanish and Brazil speaks Portuguese. In Spain itself, we saw art expand greatly as tons of people had more wealth to create and produce art. And so we start to see painters like El Greco creating new artistic styles, and we see literature like the story of Don Quixote, which is probably one of the most famous Spanish stories coming out of this time period. Spain also became incredibly powerful and started getting involved in wars all over Europe, spending money freely in order to expand their power and take advantage of their newfound status as a world power. Unfortunately, no good times last forever, and the Spanish Empire went into decline for a variety of reasons. One is that their expensive wars eventually drained the treasury, and they would spend a ridiculous amount of money building a huge fleet of ships to go invade England. And once England sunk this Spanish armada, all that money was wasted. But we'll come back to that story next unit. The other factor was inflation. All this gold and silver coming into Spain simply decreased the value of gold and silver, because if everyone has tons of silver, prices rise. The government didn't raise taxes in order to adjust for this inflation, and so over time, the royal treasury got drained and drained and drained until Spain started running out of money, despite the fact that they had all this silver coming in from the New World. So all of this led to the decline of the Spanish Empire, and then eventually Spain slipping into irrelevance. Finally, the War of Spanish Succession finalized Spain's move into being a country that no one needs to care about. At the end, other European powers ended up establishing the fate of Spain, and the Spanish Habsburg dynasty was supplanted by the Spanish Bourbon dynasty, and we don't have to think about Spain honestly ever again. In fact, this might be the last time we mention Spain in this class. So despite being a world power and creating an empire upon which the sun never sets, Spain, by the end, had spent all its money and is going to disappear into irrelevancy, and we're never going to have to talk about them again. So, with that in mind, here are your basic objectives for today. Hopefully you can explain these things and provide some details in order to support them. And when we come back in class, we'll talk more in detail about the Spanish Empire, its collapse, and what lessons we can learn from their experiences.